So buenos dias. I'm Stephen Sexauer, and this is Stephen K. This is one. Okay. And I was asked by David Kotak a while back to talk to you about pensions. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for the pension system for the County of San Diego in the States. And I said, sure. And then Jill sent me the agenda and I read it. And I said, Argentina, pensions? And I panicked. So then I saw Stephen was coming, and he's an expert in pensions and in Latin America. He is the head of the Center for Policy Research at the Atlanta Fed. So I came and begged him to join me to help.
You can add this morning.
This morning. But I do think it'd be good to do it together because we'd like to make it mostly Q&A. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to basically go through a preamble of pensions, and my basic message is they should work. They're not complicated, but obviously they don't work. So Stephen's going to talk a bit about maybe why they don't. And our goal at the end is to suggest there's some basic concepts to think about to make them work, and then we can have a discussion. So I want to do a survey. Who in the audience has an Apple Watch, or someone in their family has an Apple Watch? Pretty good. That'll be important later. Second survey question is, who has not read Jane Austen? That's pretty good. So she was one of the great students of human behavior and economics right before the Industrial Revolution. And one of her great books is Sense and Sensibility. And at the beginning of the book, the patriarch dies. All the property wealth, all the wealth, because it's Hungarian times, is going to the oldest son. And part of Jane Austen's themes was everybody else, you went into the military, you became a priest or a minister. And so this is the conversation that the son is having with his wife. And he goes, 100 pounds a year would make my sisters perfectly comfortable. And he promised his father on his deathbed, I will take care of them. But his wife hesitates. But if she should live 15 years, we'll be completely taken in. So the wife's already calculating, wait a minute, we won't have the money, she will. And then there's this great quote. If you observe, people always live forever if there's an annuity to be paid. And an annuity is a pension, right? And then it goes on to say, and she is very stout and healthy, adverse selection bias here, and she's hardly 40. And even though people, live longer now, if you made it to 40 back then, 60 feels like completely within reason. And then you can't get rid of it because it's a promise. Sound familiar? Yep, promise of pension. So what I'm going to do is just quickly develop these themes. I have the Doug Duncan problem. Okay. So I just want to make this point. When you hear pensions and crisis and actual, it could go on and on. But it's really only three things. You live for X amount of years and you work for some subset of that. So let's say you're going to live today 85 years and you retire at 54 and you start at 24. So that means you're going to work for 30 and somebody else is paying the other 54, right? I mean, it's basic arithmetic. You don't even need a calculator unless you save and then you earn some return on your savings. And then the goal is when you're not working, your job is to get up in the morning and the money shows up. So that's a basic pension. That's it. The trick is you don't know how long you live. So there's this very technical thing called longevity pooling. They're also known as tontines, but there are some weird incentives in those. But the idea is if on average, all the men in this room are going to die about 85 and the women will die at 86. So if you have a pension for the whole room, you only need enough money to make it to 85. Because the people that die early, they don't get the money. The people that die late get the money plus the interest. If you have to do it by yourself, you need about 50% more money. So it's a big deal not to be in a collective pool where if you die early, that's it, payment stop. But if you live long, you get it. You get some great benefits from, Steve and I could run a pension plan for a pretty big organization, maybe even an entire country if we were given the freedom to get the incentives right. And everybody shows up and gets their paycheck because we get the administration done and you don't have to do it yourself. Doug. All right, so why are they so valuable? I just told you this technical term, longevity pooling. We're all in the same pool. I don't have to worry about how long I live because I could die tomorrow. Steve could die when he's 105. It doesn't matter. There's enough money. You do have professional management. That's a big game. You got to go contract things. You can get. At the county, we send out a payroll check every month. We have more people sending payroll checks than we do investing. You just got to get it right. And then you get to call people up and we'd like to work for you. And I'd say, well, we would like that too. They'd say, well, you should pay us this much. And we go, no, we don't think so. Click. And then we call the next person. Well, it's hard to do that as an individual. But if you have 13 billion like we have, or 100 billion like the teacher systems do, you can get people to provide at very low cost. Okay, so remember my thing about the iPhone? This is for those that have exposure to US comics. 87 years ago in the comics in the US, the character Dick Tracy, who's that's a picture of, had an Apple iWatch, right? And who would have thought? So the reason for this is it's impossible to forecast productivity and the economy. As Dave said, his people, he's protecting this. They're trying to do 1 year forecasts. Try 30 years because that's the scale of a pension system. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically suggest why pensions fail in the big picture and then turn it over to Steve. And I'm going to go through people anchor on miracles. I think Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky gave us a great gift to think about how we make human mistakes in decision-making and what's now known as behavioral economics. If you can't access longevity pooling efficiently, and by the way, in the US, Social Security is really efficient longevity pooling. Buying an annuity from an insurance company who's betting you'll forget to keep paying the whole thing and you'll have a lapse rate to make their money is not an efficient way to do it. But that's your only option as an individual if you're not in a DB plan. And then if you get the incentives wrong, and here's a political incentive. I want your votes. You can be in the system. You don't have to contribute. So that's great. I don't have to put anything in. I just get 84 years worth of protection. People don't realize they have counterparty risk. I work for a company. The company promises to pay me. I rely on the company files for bankruptcy. And we have some very, very difficult stories where the value of the company goes over here in bankruptcy court. Patents, brand. The promise to the truck drivers who worked in the company goes over here. They get zero, and the new private equity investors get the value of the assets. The last point is really important because it matters from the worker's perspective. If you're in a scheme where you can say, I can make this more productive over 30 years, especially public sector, well, what do you do with the gains? Well, you could lower taxes, you can provide more services, or you put the money in the pension system. So a pension system that looks bust won't be bust 30 years later if you can get that kind of arrangement. It's not an economic arrangement, it's a political arrangement. Will you change work rules? Will you will you be more flexible? And then you got to believe that the person hiring you will put the money back on the system reliably. So this is anchoring on miracles. The big bar that's 18.52 if you have binoculars. I mean, those were the returns in basically the 80s and the 90s, and people said that'll happen forever. So in San Diego County, February 26th, 2002, even after the crash, but it had been close to the end of that period, the supervisors of our county voted to raise pension benefits 50%, backwards and forwards. You wonder why we're underfunded. That's probably one of the biggest reasons. And I'm going to turn this over to Steve.
So thank you. That's a great segue. Steve asked me to speak just this morning. So I thought, why not explain the reversal of pension privatization in Latin America in 5 minutes. So, so my name is Steve Kay, this is the other Steve, and I have to issue a disclaimer. I think they probably issued one too, that I speak for myself and not for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. So everyone in this room can remember there was this wave of privatization in Latin America in the 1990s. The World Bank supported it. It was part of a whole set of structural reforms. And now we've seen this reversal, and I certainly don't have to tell people in this room because Argentina is the pioneer of the pension reversal. Argentina went first, set an example for other countries, and we're talking about incentives. And so we think about why we had the wave, and now the wave is moving backwards. Not everywhere. Some countries like Chile, their response was to strengthen the solidarity pensions, the public pensions, while trying to keep the private defined contribution pensions. But I thought I'd talk about, we were talking about risk. You were talking about what happened in San Diego. Well, that happens all over the world, in Latin America too. There are two specific political risks when it comes to pension reform, and specifically to this wave of privatizations that we saw. One of them, as obviously pensions have to be around for a long time, maybe 100 years or more. And so people need to know the pensions are going to be there and have confidence. But pension reform is really, really complicated and really, really unpopular. It's popular when you raise everyone's pensions 50% retroactively. That's very popular. It's less popular to do things like raise the retirement age, or in some countries where women can retire earlier than men, and there are a whole bunch of arguments about why you might want to have the same retirement age, but actually doing that is very, very unpopular. And we see that over and over again. So what we saw with these reforms was piecemeal reform, the easy stuff you do first, or some of the hard stuff you do first, and then you delay some of the hard stuff until later. And then that later becomes even later. That's one specific political risk, is that it's an ongoing process. You raise the benefits by 50%, your successors down the road, the new mayor, the new president, has to deal with whatever mess you created. The other one is, and we saw this in Latin America, when specific to this individual capitalization, we saw, again, I'm talking in Buenos Aires, people who know this very well. You remember probably very well in 2000 when, during the crisis, when the Minister of Finance, or the government, essentially seized or forced the pension funds to purchase government bonds when facing this very, very urgent fiscal crisis. So that's another thing that happens. That happened in Eastern Europe. Governments either seizing the stock or the flow in some fashion. This happened, I could name a whole list of Eastern European countries where this happened during the financial crisis. So in fact, I was looking for examples of countries that had privatized their pension system, experienced a financial crisis, and did not seize pension fund assets. So if somebody has an example, please let me know. I'm looking. So this is part, this sort of political, I guess what I wanted to bring up in my 5 minutes was this discussion of the political risk that's part of was part of these sort of pension reforms that took place in much of Latin America and Eastern Europe. And the governments never really successfully addressed, figured out how to get around these risks, essentially. So that was my 5 minutes on Latin America. But we had time for questions, right?
Yeah, I think we we'll go to the last page, and then we'll do questions, and then we know there's lunch after that. And the headline is from a paper that was written a number of years ago, Please Don't Kill the Golden Goose, because these are very, very valuable things, pensions. You get the longevity pooling, you get the professional management, and that if they're valuable, you should work hard to get them right. And what really matters more than anything is the incentives. And when you create an incentive system that doesn't work, it will break. So for example, I like Steve's pursuit of, has anybody ever not robbed their pension system in a crisis? It's not that people are evil. It's you're a politician. Your time horizon's this long. Pension's time horizon, the money's there, and you have a legal way to take it, you take it. And so you have to think about these things at the beginning. And you have to think their wage is delayed. So when someone says you can get something for nothing, the real translation is who are they taking it from? Or how much counterparty risk do I have? And when the counterparty fails, they won't be in office. So with that, we'll be happy to take questions or.
Thanks for the presentation. A few questions. One, maybe you can share your perspective about how exactly is the pensions in the U.S. in terms of, you read a lot of situations where pensions are underfunded and the Social Security is, broken, but still, a lot of people still get, IRAs and 401ks, and so what's the overall situation in terms of retirement and the ability of people to live of the pensions and Social Security and private savings, and again going back to this problem of underfunding pensions, how real is that problem?
That's yours.
So to answer Romero's question, you have to think of three separate pools. There's the federal government pool. There is the private sector pool for companies. And there are other government employees of state and local entities. And so let me go through them in that order. If you're a federal government employee, you have zero risk of your pension because it's like Ginnie Mae. You have the full faith and credit, and it's not a giant liability of the government, and no problem there. If you're in the private system, it's a problem because they don't offer them anymore. And the ones that are still in existence are breaking. And then you find you have counterparty risk. The reason they don't offer them is they got the accounting and the incentives backwards. And as soon as the companies figured out they could jettison the pension, they did. So private company pensions in the US are a thing right now of the past. The big pension systems in the US are public, local, teachers, public employees. And there's this tension because in some states like California and Illinois, they changed the constitution of the state to make that pension promise unchangeable and ranking above debt. And so you keep piling on benefits. The taxpayers are somewhat in revolt, and there's some tension over this now. 401k, tax preferred savings, it was just an odd part of the tax code that during that big run up and got big. So if you think of the US now, there's three pillars. Social Security, which is, I think Doug said 40% replacement rate, or maybe Dave said. Your 401k, and if you're in the public sector, you have a DB. I can give you the economic numbers. If you save 10% of your starting salary and you save half of every raise, and you just get very low real returns, you can then do it. So if you're in that scenario, and is it broken? There's a debate. You can read the Boston Fed, it's over, it's a crisis. And people say, I don't see people in the streets begging, so where's the crisis?
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question pertains to where do you see U.S. pension funds in the process of diversification to EM assets, emerging market assets? Do you think it's a structural thing that will continue, or do you think that with rates in the U.S. rising and in the developed world rising, it will come to a stop?
So the question is, pension funds in the U.S. investing in emerging markets, yeah. And so on the margin, you're talking about the public plans, the big teachers plans or our plan. We're as mercenary as it can get. If we have a dollar liability, and except for where there's some social things you're supposed to do, we will go to where the highest return is. And so we're double weight emerging markets in our fund, and we'll probably be that way for a long time because there's more growth and valuations are still attractive. But just we're completely mercenaries. We'll invest in Russia if we can get our money back.
Sorry, you spoke about 401k. You spoke about 401k. They weren't implemented in Latin America, and they could have been some sort of political insurance against the expropriation of the pension companies here.
And the question is?
Do you think it could be? They weren't implemented here. They only implemented pension companies. So the private people didn't have any incentive to expropriation.
I mean, there were voluntary. You could make voluntary contributions to the. There was the option for individuals, but you're talking about companies implementing 401ks. I don't know enough to answer your question. I don't know what the incentives are for firms to do that. Certainly in the U.S., there were some incentives that probably you don't have elsewhere at the present time. Is my thought.
And I could add a piece of history for that. It was such an obscure part of changes in the tax law that it has this weird name, Section 401k, 4018, that the first plans were not even run by the Treasury Department or the Investment Department. They're run by the Human Resources Department. And the reason is that a handful of smart people, especially at Fidelity, said, oh, the tax code lets you set aside money tax-free. We'll offer a service. And the investors said, well, we're worried about paying the DB bills. So they went to the Human Resources Department and said, you could offer this benefit to your employees. And the Human Resources Department said, no, it's a headache. We'd have to hire staff. We have to pay a lot. Fidelity goes, oh, no. We'll do everything for free. And then they put Fidelity funds at about 150 basis points a year from fees. But that's not enough. They did this in the early 1980s, and then markets went up 17% per year. And I cannot underemphasize how much. When it rains that much money into a system, people, they think it's the greatest thing in the world, and they think it'll go on forever. So I think there's a lot of anecdotal and random factors that connected for the U.S. to have such a big.
Thank you guys for, sorry, we have one more? Yes.
Sorry, I have one comment and one question. The comment is regarding pension reform and the experience of Argentina back in the 90s. Argentina, like you said, did a complete pension reform. That reform had a transition fiscal cost, which was high. In fact, most of the increase in indebtedness in Argentina towards the end of the 90s had to do with this fiscal transition cost. I remember at the time when Stanley Fischer was the head of the IMF and he came to Argentina having an argument. I started my career as faculty at MIT, so I had an argument with him saying, you can't compare the fiscal accounts of Argentina with Brazil because Brazil didn't do reform. But the fund still has not taken that into account when they do fiscal analysis. And Argentina lost access to the private capital markets. And then the IMF finally decided not to disburse more money to Argentina in November 2001. And that led to a tremendous financial crisis. And of course, there was a backward, then all the reforms went backward in Argentina. So I think one aspect that should be considered if we're trying to, again, move ahead in pension reforms, and particularly in the emerging world, is that there is fiscal transition costs. And then IMF supporting this should take this in account, both in terms of loans, but also in terms of measurement. So that's the comment. And my question is regarding funding, particularly the relationship. What are the incentives? Because a lot of the venture or significant growth of the venture capital industry in the United States and the financing of technological innovation has to do also with funding from the pension funds, and also in the field of renewable energy. So I wanted if you can please tell me what are the incentives in place to allow for this funding to be channeled, because also one of the domestic critiques in Argentina to the pension reform is that the pensions were mostly invested in government bonds, that we never developed the capital market. That was one of the main objectives of the pension reform. So how did the United States did in order to help the development and strengthening of the capital market, and particularly in the areas of innovation and renewables?
Really briefly, many countries in Europe and Eastern Europe have the same situation. They're the Maastricht agreement in terms of there's a fiscal agreement, and because of the transition to the defined contribution pensions, countries asked, they got a waiver, but then the waiver from the European Union was not renewed. So they were facing the same issue. They said, can't you give us a break? There's a reason why we're facing this fiscal constraint. So.
Was part of your question using the pension money to invest in renewable resources?
Yes, and startups.
Startups?
What are the fiscal incentives for that?
So it's been my experience when I talk to a group that this question comes up. And I always wait for it because it's a beautiful question. It makes perfect logical sense to say there's all this money and let's use it to do something noble like renewable energy, or good, invest. And it goes to this, incentives. Remember my answer to Marco's question is, would we invest in emerging markets? So I'm a fiduciary. I have the authority to say where the money goes. And I only care about one thing, how much money I get back to pay the bills. But it's natural for people to say, I want you to use your money to do what I want, even if it's good and noble. So here's the request I get. They'd like us to build affordable housing for public employees in the county. Another request we get is to sell anybody who has anything to do with guns. So that this very large pool of money creates its own. It's like a large mountain like Everest or Denali that creates its own weather system. And so the turbulence of the weather system puts the system at risk because it's just such an incentive to get your hands on the money. And so, while it seems noble and logical to invest in renewable energy, how much, which kind, how much money can you make? And the person that's waiting for the check really doesn't care. They just want the check.
But my friends from the technology industry, they told me there are fiscal incentives really. Fiscal incentives in place in the United States allow channeling of the funding from pension funds.
Right.
So the question is, which are the fiscal incentives in place?
So here's how it works. The pension fund is a trust, a legal entity, and there's a board that gets to decide what to do with it, and they can set the rules. Somebody gets that board to say, go buy that investment. And the board then writes a rule for that pension fund. So you can do it. I'm just arguing it works against having the system work. The system I work for, we don't do it. The board has decided. But in other systems, the board has said, we want so much money spent this way. The evidence is when you do that, you get lower returns. But
what fiscal incentives
our fund has zero.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you again for the presentation. We have a break. we have a break until